Philosophy of Karl Popper had a big impact on my life. I think today most people associate Karl Popper with philosophy of science, philosophy of scientific method, but he was also known in his own time, and to some extent hated in his own time, for being a critic of Marxism, for being a public philosopher who rejected communism, and not in a shallow sense, not just dealing with the historical reality of what communist governments had done, but digging into the philosophical underpinnings of Karl Marx, Hegel, etc., and showing in a very meaningful sense that communism was rotten to the core, that it was bad not only in practice but also in principle, that it wasn't merely a theory that was poorly implemented in the world, but was a deeply flawed theory to begin with. And the book I'm thinking of by Karl Popper, especially here, is The Poverty of Historicism. A very strange and awkward title. And by contrast, I think today more people probably read Karl Popper's books with a uplifting and catchy title dealing with the nature of scientific progress, scientific thinking versus pseudoscience. Karl Popper, I don't know, he kind of writes easy to understand anecdotes about Einstein and how Einstein theorized about the position of the moon bending the light of the sun during an eclipse. Little anecdotes from the philosophy of science that he picks up and makes seem kind of provocative and profound. But that is not the side of Karl Popper's work that mattered to me at all. What really mattered to me was the critique that starts by dealing with Plato and ends by dealing with Karl Marx, with Hegel in between, in The Poverty of Historicism. And I'll always remember the bookshelf I was standing at. The way I discovered that book was the most straightforward, peculiar way to find a book of philosophy. I was standing in front of the bookshelf in the library. That wasn't what I was looking for. That wasn't the research I was doing. And I saw the 2 volumes of The Poverty of Historicism sitting on the shelf. And the title alone, even though it is such a strange title, it immediately seemed clear to me that this would deal with philosophy of Hegel, which it does at great length. And I could immediately imagine, even though it's such a strange title, how this would relate to quite a few different things I've been reading and researching in the years leading up to that. So I'm recalling this now without going back and looking at the book again. These videos are not really about textbook philosophy. They're about the significance that this kind of philosophy has had in my own life. I can also say I'm reminded of a pair of filmmakers who made the intentional decision not to go back and reread a certain short story. It was actually a short story by Edgar Allan Poe when they decided to make a film about it, that the filmmakers would have a film based on their memories of the short story. It was a story they'd read as school children rather than being based on the source text. You know, they're going to make a film based on their imperfect memories of the text. So in that same way, too, I can say that these videos are really about the aspects of the philosophy that stayed with me and that mattered to me. I'm not presenting this as a book review, and I'm not competing with Wikipedia to give you a kind of objective survey of what this philosophy is or why it matters. And in some ways, as I said before, I think this is the kind of reflection that YouTube as a medium is very well suited to. And conversely, I do think it's a bit hollow when people make some kind of grandiose claim that philosophy of Aristotle is tremendously meaningful to them, but they seem to be unable to back that up with any particulars. Does the philosophy of Aristotle actually impact how you vote? Anything about your politics? You know, what you're doing politically with your life now as an adult. Does it really change how you think and feel and behave? Politically, personally, or otherwise? Years now after reading Aristotle. Those are the kinds of reflections I would like to see on YouTube myself. Why did the philosophy of Karl Popper mean so much to me? Well, I can say this off the bat. When I first saw what Karl Popper had to say about Plato, so this is the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, his critique of Plato and his criticism of the misinterpretation of Plato, it was such a contrast to all the attempts to make Plato seem mysterious and impressive and profound that I'd been dealing with in the classroom, and in my own life in general. You know, there really was a very different school of thought, even on mainstream television in the old days. But I saw it in the classroom, I saw it in television, I saw it kind of everywhere I went in Western culture, of taking simple and down-to-earth things and making them seem mysterious and impressive, where it seemed like the main purpose in teaching Plato was not to understand what he had to say or why he said it, but was just to try to dazzle the audience with some sense that this was overwhelming or inspiring. And of course, in many cases, it's not. A large part of Plato's philosophy is pretty down-to-earth and still reads off the page in a down-to-earth way today. When I read Karl Popper's critique of Plato, so for example, his criticism of what Plato has to say about the nature of justice, these were all questions I had asked myself, that I had asked sort of out loud in looking at my textbook, and that to some extent I had even asked my professor, and that seemingly nobody had any good answers to. Why was it that in my own classroom, Plato was introduced, as being integrally about justice, Plato's Republic, as being the question of what is the meaning of justice, and then absolutely no attention was paid to the definition of justice that Plato presents within that book? There were all these really strange contradictions in sort of how Plato was glamorized for a university student and the reality of what Plato had to say and how he said it even. And the same is true, of course, when I was looking at philosophy of Hegel. There was this huge gap between the reality of what Hegel was, what he had to say, and even how he was saying it, and the way in which Hegel was being glorified, especially at that time. So I was in university after 1989. 1989, for those of you who don't remember, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think for a few decades after 1989, instead of people really admitting the extent to which Marxism had ended in failure, a lot of energy within academia was going back into trying to revalorize Marxism and revalorize philosophy of Hegel, as if to hold on to whatever they thought was good or redeemable of lasting value in the intellectual legacy of Marxism, despite the fact that the collapse of the Soviet Union raised such important questions about how Western academia had come to this point of regarding, Karl Marx and Hegel of being of such paramount importance. Anyway, so now I don't know what's happened since then. I mean, I do not have a sense of, the further crumbling of the Marxist edifice within academia, since, say, the year 2003. But I was in some ways, in Western academia at a time when they were failing to face up to how flawed their own teaching of philosophy had been, especially in terms of Marx and Hegel. So if anything, I was inside academia at a time when a lot of professors who had taught Marx in exactly the same way for decades before 1989, they had adjusted what they were teaching, but they had only made it more abstract, more vague, more grandiose, more glorified. They were reaching further, to try to make Hegel seem meaningful and important to a new generation of students. And again, in looking at Karl Popper, so here in this one book, it's one book in 2 volumes, Poverty of Historicism, I saw this down-to-earth, in touch with reality, meaningful critique of Plato. It was such a contrast to the evasive and, I think, intentionally misleading nonsense I'd encountered that thus far, in Plato, and at all levels, in terms of peer-reviewed articles and what have you. Really strange and obfuscatory approach of not admitting what this text is about and why people are talking about it. And then again in volume 2, when you're looking at philosophy of Hegel and philosophy of Karl Marx, it just seemed that in Karl Popper I was looking at somebody who was willing to acknowledge what the text said, what the author's intention really was, and that was then asking in a meaningful and down-to-earth sense, what does this mean in our lives now? Wasn't trying to bedazzle an audience of students, wasn't trying to convince you this was the most important thing, wasn't trying to convince you this was the most important book of its century, or anything of the kind. Was willing to deal with kind of the good and the bad of it. Karl Popper, too, many people were sort of shocked, but many people were simply shocked that he dared to criticize socialism itself, communism itself, Marxism itself. But one of the very simple things he would say, he says it within that book, and he said it in debate afterwards, he said, I'm not debating the vague claim to help the poor. The general ethical claim that communists and left-wingers make, that they want to help poor people. He said, the point is we have to move beyond using that as an excuse for everything that's wrong with the philosophy or as an excuse for everything that's wrong with their politics. And we have to acknowledge that all kinds of other philosophies, including the Catholic Church, have made this claim, or still make this claim, that they help the poor, that they care about the poor, that they want to improve the lives of the poor and downtrodden. But there's just no dotted line connecting these kinds of claims and the justifications for either specific regimes like the Soviet Union, or the specific obtuse reinterpretation of Karl Marx. It was already being reinterpreted in a very strange way by Lenin, and then on and on by Stalin and through other communist regimes, what have you. And there's no justification to claim to help the poor for the core tenets of and beliefs of Marxism in the first place. Now, the reality is I was raised in a family, and I was raised in a political and social context that was so left-wing that I was very much expected to become a socialist or communist of some kind. And it's not really true to say I rebelled against that, because I grew up, after 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was this broad awareness on the left wing that what they were doing wasn't working and had to change. They needed new ideas and new directions. But nobody knew what to do with that impulse. So, it just wasn't the case at that time when I was in university, let's say around the year 2000, 1999, year 2000. It's not the case that there was a left-wing establishment responding to me with shock and horror, although my own father was genuinely shocked and horrified when he saw me reading Karl Popper. It's a sign of just how left-wing he was. Just to actually see the books, to see that I was reading the Poverty Restores. I mean, he gave me his decades-old denunciation of why Karl Popper is a reactionary and an enemy of the people or enemy of the working man or whatever the case may be. That was real. Those were real political cross-currents, going on around me. One of my own professors, I remember he was a labor union organizer, far left-wing. He was actually invited to take over the leadership of the NDP, the left-wing party in Canada. He had been a lifelong socialist or something like that. But I remember that particular professor, whenever you'd sit down and talk to him, he was at that time doing research on the automotive industry and labor unions and this kind of stuff. There was definitely this sense of all of the political aspirations and all of the intellectual pretensions of the left wing having been deflated, and this open question of what next. But I got to tell you, what Karl Popper did for me was give me the confidence to look at the canon of Western philosophy and say, okay, so everyone's asking what next. Left-wing Hegelianism is not it. It's not going to be going back to Hegel. It's not going to be going back to Plato. It's not going to be going back to Immanuel Kant. It's not going to be going back to Lenin or Stalin or all these other things. And at that time, it seems unbelievable now, there were people who called themselves Hegelian feminists. There were people who were making all these attempts to reinvigorate either the philosophy of Hegel as a left-wing political platform or the philosophy of Marx or both. There was all this stuff going on. And reading Karl Popper, it gave me a sense of confidence in my own sanity. Because when I read, even just sticking with that example of Plato, why was it that when I read Plato, I was asking all these obvious questions that seemingly nobody was even allowed to ask and that none of the academic literature was answering? And then, beyond that, gave me a sense of confidence in asking those broader questions. What was the future of progressive politics in Canada or what have you? And say, it's not this. The future of progressive politics in Canada was not going to be going back and making a bunch of excuses for the political philosophy of the recent past.